Signore e signori, buonasera. Welcome to New York University, Casa Italiana, Zerilli-Marimò. My name is Stefano Albertini. I'm the director of the Casa. We wanted to start this evening by showing you this short documentary. We call it a mini doc. We produce basically one of these for every exhibit. It's a lot of work that goes into it. We have the fortune of working with a brilliant team of young Italian and American filmmakers, and we're very proud of the stuff they do. And when, of course, we have stars like Nicola and Ara, everything is easier. And today we are here to talk about the exhibit that we have upstairs. It's an exhibit that was co-curated by Nicola Lucchi and Ara Merjian. And of course, if you have not seen it already, I invite you to watch it again in depth. When you go out, we just received confirmation that the exhibit is going to stay here until April 15. So I'm asking also you to send out emails and tell your friends to come and check out the exhibit. They have plenty of time to do so. Now, since we have a packed evening and a lot of guests, I'm just going to introduce to you one of the two curators of the exhibit. That is my colleague and friend, Professor Ara Merjian, who is a professor of Italian studies here in our department, director of graduate studies, always here, and he was also an affiliate of the Institute of Fine Arts and the Center for European and Mediterranean Studies and Comparative Literature here at New York University. Among his books as an author, I remember Giorgio De Chirico and the Metaphysical City, Nietzsche, Paris and Modernism, Against the Avant-Garde, Pier Paolo Pasolini, Contemporary Art and New Capitalism, and two new volumes. One of them is very relevant to what we're discussing tonight, and is Fragments of Totality, Futurism, Fascism, and the Sculpture of Avant-Garde with Yale University Press, and then Futurism, a very short introduction, published with Oxford University Press. He's also finishing a volume that is going to come out in the fall, Bit Black Queer, Pasolini's Other America. So this gives you an idea of the many interests of Ara. I thank him for the time, the energy, and the intelligence that he devoted to curating this exhibit with Nicola Lucchi. And of course, this is also a sort of a celebration of Ara's two publications in Futurism. So we took the occasion of his two books to have this exhibit. I hope you enjoyed the panel. Please welcome Professor Ara Merjian.
All right. So because we do have a packed evening, I'm just going to give a whirlwind synthesis, to use a very futurist word, of how we got from the founding and manifesto of Futurism, to, if not actual manifestations and realizations, then imaginations of what future constructions informed by the futurist imagination might have been. Of course, from its founding in 1909, the ringleader and lightning rod of Futurism hailed the multicolored polyphonic tides of revolution in the modern capitals. But Italy's modern capital, like many of its other cities, saddled with patrimony and with the past, Rome and its Forum, reminding James Joyce in 1907 of a man who lives by exhibiting to travelers his grandmother's corpse. So hardly the center of modernity that the futurists might have hoped for. By contrast, it's one semi-industrialized city where, not coincidentally, many of its early practitioners lived, including Umberto Boccioni, in many ways the most advanced and important artist, but also theorist of the group, did have, as you can tell in the back of this idyllic landscape with these plane trees and smokestacks looming in the back, some intimations of urban modernity as it was developing in Italy's north, which has always really been the anchor, particularly the industrial triangle between Milan, Genoa, and Turin, of a kind of developing modernity. Italy was well behind in that sense, and this is, of course, what informed the Futurism's deep self-conscious about being what the French Romantic writer Lamartine called Europe's graveyard. Even before Futurism was officially launched, some of its future painters, like Giacomo Balla, who was based in Rome and became one of the early teachers of many of the Futurist painters before joining the group himself after 1909, obviously took the city as the crux of many of his images, as did so many of his fellow Futurists, to the point where already by 1910 and 11, a caricature in the French press called Commedia imagined what Venice would look like once the Futurists were done with it. They had, of course, infamously pledged to pave over its canals to create highways. And you even have an Italian Eiffel Tower along with zeppelins and smokestacks replacing the Venetian lagoon and its romantic commonplaces. But there were, closer to home, some precedents, some pre-futurist precedents to how they imagined not only the city, but the way to represent it as something not fixed and static, but coming into being out of its own materiality. The sculptor Medardo Rosso, hugely important for the futurists. And again, in his imagination of a Paris boulevard, taking the city as both the site, but also the material, the very idea of how we might reimagine aesthetics. And an early large canvas Boccioni, which like so many, you can see uptown at MoMA, the city rises, an absolutely giant sprawling canvas, which invites your body into it. The futurists said, actually, we want to put the spectator in the center of the picture. Here we have a building coming into construction, which the futurists hailed as a kind of beautiful poem in its own right, and of course industrial signifiers and smokestacks, but also the labor of horses being bridled by urban workers. On a formal level, the kind of interpenetration of their bodies by energy, by what Boccioni called force lines, the idea that the body, particularly in the city, is always intersected by angles, by energy, by movement, as his aesthetics informed as much by the philosophy of Henri Bergson as of Nietzsche. Still early on, before they discover Cubism, informed perhaps by kind of romantic tropes of mistiness, of symbolic, melancholic even romantic tropes. But once they adapt the idiom of Cubism, after traveling to Paris in 1912, everything changes. And here, again, yet another work with which we're blessed to be able to see here in New York at the Metropolitan, Boccioni's real kind of manifesto of sculpture, development of a body, of a bottle in space, which offered, as he called it, a kind of architecture in its own right. One of the things that he wanted Futurism to do in order to redress even the sculpture of someone like Medardo, whose work they've greatly admired, was that it lacked architecture, as he put it. And so the influence, even obliquely or belatedly, of Boccioni's sculpture on rationalist architect, on the notion of architecture not simply as a fixed, static entity, but as something moving, at least conceptually. Even in our Guggenheim uptown, the spiral staircase of the museum is indebted in some ways obliquely to this legacy of coming into being rather than merely existing. Boccioni wanted to write a manifesto of architecture, but Marinetti essentially says, hold off. We actually have a real architect who's a practicing architect who will be the group's official architect, and so suppresses Boccioni's manifesto of architecture. He had already written several other manifestos, and Marinetti helped to rewrite the manifesto of futurist architecture by Antonio Sant'Elia, this dashing young architect, again from Italy's north, who would tragically die in World War I, like several other futurists. But not before having issued a portfolio of works which would far outlive his own body in the 20th century, which still, more than 100 years later, in the freshness of their vision, the precision of their lines, their elevation, echo in a huge amount of ways, which we'll hear in a number of instances tonight. His work, too, like his painter and sculptor peers, informed by some elements of 19th century romanticism, the quote-unquote liberty style of the late 19th and early 20th century, as you can tell in this cathedral, which retains some elements of kind of a Gothic sensibility, and his colleague, Mario Chiattone here, who worked closely with Sant'Elia. You can tell also in the sort of almost Egyptian-like massing of volumes, not quite here yet at the visions of modernity, which they would arrive at eventually. Another artist whose work features upstairs, Virgilio Marchi, in the 20s, after a brief season as a visionary futurist architect, goes on to much greater success actually in set design. But in the meantime, some of his fantastic visionary images, which oftentimes put us in mind of Disney as much as of Futurism, are not surprisingly somewhat decorative, right? You also had, very importantly, some attempts at Cubist architecture quite early on. But as you can tell, these are really sort of surface treatments. This is not the interpenetration of sort of curtains of glass, of a crystallization, of a lightening of mass and free plan that you get later with rationalist architecture. This is essentially the treatment of a surface which looks still almost vaguely Gothic. It's really not until Sant'Elia's work that you get these visions which would influence everyone from Le Corbusier to, in some instances, Zaha Hadid and other even more contemporary architects. Interestingly, and this is perhaps one of the most poignant things about Sant'Elia's work, is that none of his buildings was ever built. It remains in the imagination. It remains visionary. The only half example is a monument, and this revisits something that Nicola said in the short video, was by a rationalist architect named Giuseppe Terragni in the city of Como, a monument to the fallen in World War I, reinterpreted as very much a fascist-informed monument here as it was conceived in 1930 and 33. And Terragni himself, the author of one of the fascist regime's most important examples of rationalist architecture. They may not have been realized by Sant'Elia himself, but they certainly have had echoes in contemporary architecture for everything from stepped facades to the integration of the street into architecture itself. And as I mentioned, Sant'Elia, well after his death, remained a kind of talisman of the fascist regime, though he actually had deep socialist sympathies, was reclaimed as a genius not only of Futurism, but of Futurism in its ideologically fascist guises, a deeply polemical and controversial and mostly erroneous interpretation. Just finally, architecture for the Futurists was not only the skyscraper, but also the spoon. And Balla and De Pero, a pair working together in Rome, issued by the humble title in 1915, The Futurist Reconstruction of the Universe, by which they entailed or intended a reimagination of every single imaginable surface, forum, medium, phenomenon in the image of Futurism. And this entailed, not surprisingly, from the start, sculpture, objects that could serve as kind of instances of architecture in miniature, with new materials featuring everything from talc to glass to string, and bearing titles like colored plastic complex of velocity, and frastuono is what? How would you translate frastuono? Putting all the Italians on the spot, Jesus. This is the Casa Italiana, come on.
Rumore di una bomba.
Rumore, the sound of a bomb, right? Yes, exactly. Balla himself coming to design what we would call now interior design, and he's even given us the cue that here should be hung a futurist painting, right? But it's no longer confined simply to the frame of the painting. It has become, Futurism has become the room itself, and eventually this would be the case of Balla's own studio as it developed, which again, the notion of reconstructing the entire universe, not simply the walls, but also the door jambs and bookshelves and coat hangers, and every instance of the built environment, essentially. There are some sort of failed instances of this, which was exhibited in New York around 2014 when they had the big Futurist retrospective at the Guggenheim, this sort of dining room set by Gerardo Dottori, which really sort of domesticates futurist geometry to a kind of bourgeois dining room, right? This is not the dynamism, the shaken violence that the futurists imagined. It's really actually transferred that energy back into the safe domestic space that the futurists wanted to shake up. At least formally, there are some other sort of more interesting applications, like this furniture designed for the fascist minister and pilot Italo Balbo, who in 1933 flew his plane from Rome to Chicago in the first transatlantic flight. And it was flight, actually, as you can tell by one of the paintings upstairs by Osvaldo Peruzzi, which temporarily kind of reinvigorated Futurism. Reinvigorated not only its perspectives, but its conception of the city, which would now be integrated with the air and the airplane. And this came to pass not only in visions that imagined the city as seen from a plane, but in architecture that incorporated aviation into it. The 30s was the era of what they called aeromania. Mussolini himself had his pilot's license. Everyone who imagined himself to be a virile fascist was interested in flight, or at least in its public imagination. And then, just finally, in terms of this imagining of the city redone in a futurist guise, we have a postcard that Balla sent to De Pedo in the 30s with Milan's Duomo in the background and this Milanese boulevard, again, Milan, the most kind of modern of Italy's cities, and it says futurist triumph, trionfo futurista, which of course is given the lie by the way that the city still appears as largely kind of a bourgeois 19th century cityscape. But they still persisted, and here's a postcard by De Pedo sent from New York, from his time in New York, with which he's enlivened this building with these kind of futurist squiggles and an exclamation point, and not giving up on tearing down the museums, a proclamation that the Metropolitan Museum be destroyed. So one other thing that you might be thinking about, at least with the painting that the exhibition opens, is how much New York loomed large in the imagination of a redesigned city, of the city of the future, really. And Athos Casarini, himself embracing futurism only upon his return to Italy after the early 1910s, but already New York and its massing of buildings in lower Manhattan seized his attention, as it would for so many others, including Sant'Elia in his appropriations or allusions at least to Harvey Wiley's imagination of these multi-tiered cities. And these, of course, filter back, as we'll, I believe here later on, into back across the Atlantic into various European conceptions of utopian and dystopian cities. But just leaving us with the last image of the persistence of New York in the early 20th century for the European modern imagination of the city is the Russian, Ukrainian artist Kazimir Malievich's imagining of a modernist city reimagined in what he called suprematist terms, right? In these sort of very stripped down abstractions, but projected onto the skyline of New York, which remains, for better and for worse, oftentimes the nexus, the touchstone of what we might imagine as the city of tomorrow. So, with that, I'd like to invite our next speaker, Dr. Nicola Lucchi, who is Director of Research and Education at Magazzino Italian Art in Cold Spring, New York. At Magazzino, Nicola oversees the library, research, and fellowship programs and administers the publications and activities of the museum's education center, which will be inaugurated, notably, and open to schools and college classes later this spring. Prior to joining Magazzino, Nicola worked as executive director of the Center for Italian Modern Art, where he managed the center's research fellowship program and cultural events. He received his PhD in Italian studies from New York University in 2016, and I'm still proud to have advised his amazing dissertation, which will be a book in short order. on Fiat Longotto factory and the development of modernity. And he's taught at CUNY's, Queen's College and Dickinson College. He's published articles, books, chapters, and catalog essays on futurism, the relationship between poetry and the visual arts, and Bruno Munari. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Nicola Lucchi.
Thank you, everyone, for being here and braving the storms outside. Is the presentation...
You have to press escape, and then it's on the desk.
Oh, there we go. Well, in these few minutes, I would like to illustrate the visual argument that Ara and I tried to unfold with the installation of the exhibition upstairs, Metropoli, Visionary Architecture from Futurism to Rationalism. This is a small exhibition, but it encompasses, we should be clear, a very large time span from the early 1910s to the early 1940s, a time that saw two world wars in which Italy played an important role and certainly in one case a very problematic role. It was a time of momentous social and economic transformations for the country, including in its political makeup, which morphed from a liberal democratic government under a constitutional monarchy to a totalitarian regime under the auspices of fascism with the blessing of the aforementioned constitutional monarchy. From a strictly artistic perspective, the 3 decades at the center of the exhibition were also very lively, with avant-garde movements such as Futurism fervently in dialogue with counterparts across Europe and sometimes beyond, a phase of return to order after World War I, and a constant push and pull between the freedoms of artistic expression and the demands of an aestheticized politics as the political, theatrical machine of the fascist regime required. Coming more specifically to the terms that define our exhibition, which is the Futurism and Rationalism, the passage between the two is not an obvious one. The two movements are distinct, and while they do share a contentious relationship with fascism and a fate of seeing very few of their ideas and projects come to actual construction, they also diverge in important ways. Futurist architecture was bold and visionary. It was radical in proclaiming its departure from historical styles and rooted in a modernist ethos that celebrated technological progress with a form of lyrical technolatry. It envisioned cities that soared vertically, reflecting an embrace of modern skyscrapers and the promise of air travel. These structures were often depicted as interconnected, forming a network of dynamic, flowing spaces designed for rapid movement. These projects were very similar, yet utopian. They were grounded in the reality of technological advancement, but reaching for an idealized, almost fantastical future. The aesthetic was playfully mechanistic. It celebrated machines, industrial materials, but in ways that often remained artistic and literary, drawing inspiration from poetry, art, and avant-garde experimentation. Lastly, futurist architecture was often ephemeral, reflecting the ever-changing nature of modern life and the impermanence of the cities it aimed to revolutionize. And perhaps it is not a case that much of the futurist architecture that we did see historically was built and later demolished in the context of international expositions and trade fair pavilions. Rationalist architecture, on the other hand, struck a balance between innovation and heritage to some degree. It was concerned with modernity, but remained aware of tradition, a tradition that it sought to reinterpret through what they called a spirito nuovo, a novel spirit, which certainly was an expression that they borrowed from reading Le Corbusier. Rationalism created designs that respected historical proportions and yet embraced the technological advancements of its time. Rationalists were concerned with function. They crafted buildings that prioritized practicality and utility. They were concerned with society, creating buildings that would serve collective needs through their design, and not only being focused on the inventiveness of the artist. Their approach emphasized essential and proportioned structures, stripping away unnecessary ornamentation, focusing on pure forms that conveyed the clarity of the purpose of the built architectural space that they defined. As such, at the core of both movements, however, as you can see in these depictions, remained an interest in urban spaces, in envisioning the shape that Italian cities could take according to this new aesthetic principle, according to the modern materials such as concrete, steel, and glass that were behind some of these major innovations, and the new industrial modes of production and transportation. So, to bring together these, we decided to begin with this first wall, in which we're trying to run the gamut of the various ways in which Futurism found itself interested, taking an interest in the potential of urban space as a tabula rasa for refashioning of the universe, to put it with Balla and De Pero. You can see here that the paintings bookending this sequence were sort of a homage to New York, and Ara has already discussed this in part, but the first work is an early depiction of the New York harbor bustling with activity by Athos Casarini, who was a one-time futurist hailing from Bologna. He spent a few years here in New York before returning to Italy to fight and die in the First World War. The work is not futurist in style, but it clearly illustrates how large the idea of the modern metropolis loomed in the mind of avant-garde artists, and also how New York specifically was that incarnation of the modern metropolis. The final painting tells the same story, but refers, as Ara mentioned, to the transatlantic crossing that Italo Balbo took with seaplanes in 1933, which at the time, this flight was a remarkable technological feat and one of aeronautical travel. And it tells us of a moment also in Futurist's own story, the phase of Futurist aero painting, which incorporated an architectural vision of the cityscape alongside references to the flight and deep political connection. I will not go again in the details here, but as Ara mentioned before with other examples, the city of New York loomed very large in across the globe in terms of the avant-gardes, in terms of these conceptions of the new city, and the products such as the short film Manhattan from 1921, with its focus on verticality, the interplay of light and shadows, the fragmented rhythmic editing, mirrors very much the futurist obsession with speed, energy, and movement. Moving towards the center of the wall, we have a set of alternative futurist visions of the urban space. On the one side, Osvaldo Licini's work is vibrant and lyrical. The street becomes a dynamic and nearly abstract tapestry of colors and forms. The approach here is emotive and painterly. It emphasizes movement, but it nearly tears apart the urban fabric. This is a composition that suggests a poetic engagement with modernity, prioritizing expression over structure. In contrast, Virgilio Marchi, who was indeed an architect, defines more meticulously the space. It is rooted in the visionary ambition of futurist architecture that was first seen in Antonio Sant'Elia and Mario Chiattone's work. The project reflects a detailed exploration of space, of function, of the way that the urban infrastructure would interact with the buildings. So on the one hand, we have a celebration of the city vibrancy through distortion and color, whereas Marchi captures something more about a conceptual vision of urban progress. And finally, in the middle, what is very interesting here is this example by Farfa, which merges art, technology, and nature. This is an antenna, and it's constructed using the typographic characters spelling Arte Futurista, which transforms the letters into the sidewalls of an architectural element, blurring the lines between text and physical structure. So it's turning typography into a tool for defining physical space, reminding us again of futurist ultimate playfulness when it came to architecture, and a commitment to rethinking the possibilities of form and function in the modern world. And certainly Farfa had in mind the influence of words in freedom poetry, which is a key experiment in futurist poetics, where the text is liberated from the traditional constraints of syntax, and it becomes a visual and dynamic medium on the blank page. And in the examples here, De Pero is very clear that in his Tavola Parolibera is giving us a sense of the skyscrapers of New York. But even here, Cangiullo in Piedigrotta gives us a glimpse into the various elements of the Neapolitan urban space, with the park of the Villa Comunale and the trams running in the top portion of the page. The project of Farfa is certainly also reminiscent and in dialogue with ephemeral architecture of the time, such as this important project by Fortunato De Pero for the pavilion of the Treves Publishing House in the Monza Biennale, where letters were literally used as the building blocks of a building. So it's turning the text into a physical structure, and it truly thinks about how this can be configured. The second room of the exhibition continues to delve into the subject of futurist architecture, focusing on the works of two individuals that indeed survived World War I, unlike Sant'Elia, and brought forth some of their ideals into the interwar era in the different political climate that saw the rise of fascism. While at various times fascism and futurism did work hand in hand, I will say that fascism did not make particular use of futurist architecture for various reasons. One, perhaps, is that certainly the radical quality of some of these projects was at odds with the conservative thinking of the regime. It was also at odds, of course, with the 1,000 years old of urban fabric that we find in every Italian city, and also with one of the key concepts of the fascist refashioning of Italian city spaces, which was the concept of Romanità, which, thanks to Margherita Sarfatti, one of the most important Italian intellectuals of the interwar era, had come to permeate the vast majority of the large public projects undertaken by the fascist state. That said, these works persisted. Virgilio Marchi, you see him here at the beginning of his career with these almost organic, very imaginative architectural drawings, eventually matures into a manifesto, Architettura Futurista, that provides a structured framework for what he thought of what a futurist city could be, to the point that in the second edition of the book, he included a potential for a piano regolatore of Rome. Piano regolatore is the equivalent here for a master plan for land use. And this master plan included very unusual visions of what Rome could have been, such as the building that you see there, which is Palazzo dell'Aria. It was supposed to be a ministry of aviation for Italy's capital, and its bold and monumental forms and detailing reflects both a functional purpose and an aspiration to capture the spirit of flight. This was a building that supposedly would have had landing runways on the rooftop. Imagine if in Rome you could have such a structure. And certainly, Mussolini did change Rome in very significant ways, but they were a mix of, rethinking the historical past with the Via dei Fori Imperiali and projects of that sort, and on the other hand, the experiment of Eur and many others in the mix. If the fascist regime only gave limited space to these futurist architectural projects, some private companies did, however, encourage experimentation, especially in contexts that could double as elements of a coordinated advertising campaign. So here you have Nicola Dulgerov, a Bulgarian native who had enrolled at the Bauhaus in Weimar and arrived in Italy in 1926 to pursue a career as an architect and a designer. And here you have him designing for the Birra Wurer brewery in Brescia, the headquarters, integrating this bold typography into the architecture with this oversized red W of the company logo, serving as both branding and part of the architecture. So it's transforming the facade into a symbol of modernity and of corporate identity. This type of project was undertaken in a number of ways. You see it here, for instance, at this Amaro Cora bar. And it is something that was at the core of futurist thinking from the beginning, the idea of branding and advertisements as key elements of a futurist metropolis. You see here in this drawing of La Città Nuova, and there Sant'Elia had conceived of a space for a reclame luminosa, a electrified advertisement crowning the top of his own skyscraper. And electricity was, in fact, another major attractive of the modern metropolis. Dulgarov's nocturnal drawing for the Florence Santa Maria Novella station emphasizes the transformative role of electrification in shaping the modern city. The interplay of the uplighting lamps and the shadow of the monument evokes the idea of a city that runs as a 24-hour environment, bustling with frenetic activity, and it aligns with this idea that the city is an organism powered by technological advancements. Speaking of train stations, I should say that the public competitions that the fascist regime organized for the design of new train stations was an important phenomenon at the time, which brought different schools of architecture to a confrontation, to a moment of measuring themselves against one another and against the infrastructure of the train, which at the time probably still represented the epitome of industrialization, more so than the automobile, which was becoming more common, but the grand narrative of personal transportation and the Autostrada del Sole is something that really comes to Italy in the post-war era, in the economic miracle. In this photo here, you see two photographs of architectural models for Venezia Santa Lucia, another project that was undertaken at the time. And the case of Santa Maria Novella in Florence, let me just spend a minute here, is, I think, a hotspot to understand the tensions that dominated the architectural debate in Italy during the interwar era. The competition was not won by Dulgarov, but was won by a team of young architects called Gruppo Toscano, led by Giovanni Michelucci, who moved on to create one of the most remarkable terminal stations in Italy. The building is incredibly accessible, makes spectacular use of Thermolux glass, provides natural illumination to most of its environments. You see here the installation of electromechanical elements, such as this beautiful clock. And yet the building is indicative of tensions between modernity and tradition, or at the very least, different approaches to modernity. So compare here the uscita from the pedestrian hall that has this incredible illuminated lettering and the electric clock, but the clock is surrounded by photographs of landscapes, providing tourists with the reassurance that they haven't disembarked in New York, but in fact they're still in picturesque Italy, and they can see where they have arrived. And the same can be found in what is now the Feltrinelli bookshop, which for a long time was a McDonald's. And I remember for many years during my youth that you could have a Big Mac underneath Ottone Rosai's Tuscan landscapes. So it's quite a picture there. Not all projects undertaken that took place under fascism had fascist origins. For instance, the covering of the network of Milan's Navigli, the capillary system of water canals that provided commerce and transportation to the city for centuries, was part of the master plan of Milan since the 1890s, but it was during fascism that the final push to complete this work took place. And in the spirit of vast public infrastructure that existed, rationalist architects sought to insert themselves in this debate with a style that perhaps interpreted modernities in ways that spoke more closely to the interests of fascism than Futurism did. But even that is not really truly what happened. You see here, for instance, what you can see in this work by Ridolfi is the presence, to some degree, of a portico The portico is a very traditional element of Italian cities, and certainly something that we can see in many rationalist architectures. But the projects that came to fruition, alas, were a bit different. Fascism had plans of not only architectural refashioning of the country, but biopolitical refashioning through its projects of land reclamation, through its colonization projects abroad, and through the creation of città di fondazione, so brand new cities that were built according to plans to revitalize certain depressed areas of Italy. This is the case of Littoria, now Latina, shown here in this photo montage by Munari. This is the case of Carbonia in Sardinia, where we see some of these architects more closely aligned with the regime, providing some of these visions. And these are modern, yes, but also with an influx of a certain classical proportions and traditions still looming large. And you see the piazza today as it is, as it has come to fruition. It is not quite what was conceived, but you can see the trace of that. What is interesting in these objects that we included in this portion of the exhibition is the use of photography, photomontage, and photocollage to conceive of urban thinking. That's something that the Futurists did not quite do in the same way. Futurism and photography have a very difficult relationship. Boccioni did not think that photography was a proper form of art. And as such, for many years, even if there are Futurist photographers, but Futurism, photography has lived on the sidelines of Futurism, whereas from Le Corbusier on, the idea of photographing architecture and thinking about architecture through photography is fundamental to modernity. And certainly the rationalists and the projects that took place in the fascist regime respond to that. And to conclude, the exhibition, as you see here as we go towards the end, closes with the projects for EUR, which was purportedly should have been Mussolini's grand final realization of a complete new architectural center, originally planned for the Universal Expo of 1942, that was supposed to take place in Rome, and of course, for the obvious reasons of World War II, did not exist. It included an arc that later took a sort of a second life here in the United States, thanks to a different architect that was probably inspired by this. But what we have there, the neighborhood did in parts and in large part get built, also in the post-war era. But I will conclude saying that my friend Alessandro Giammei recently published a book titled, I'll translate it into the English, it says, Renaissance is a zombie. And I want to borrow that occult idea when I think about EUR, because perhaps it is not a zombie, but it is a ghost. Those are buildings that live between ideological concerns that are now bankrupt, as well as modernist languages that have passed and that are, in fact, not even in line, neither, I would say, with Futurists nor with Rationalists, but they're really monuments to themselves and to what can happen to architecture when ideology becomes the dominant reading through which we imagine our lived spaces. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicola. Next up, we have Vito Adriaensens, who is a film scholar and filmmaker and assistant professor of experimental film and media at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. His research focuses on the interaction between cinema and the visual arts, with his focus on silent cinema. He's the author of Velvet Curtains and Gilded Frames, The Art of Early European Cinema with Edinburgh University Press, and a co-author from the same press of a very cool volume called Screening Statues, Sculpture and Cinema. As a practitioner, Vito works mainly on celluloid, and his experimental work has been screened and exhibited internationally. Please join me in welcoming Vito.
Thank you, and bear with me as I try to pull up this PowerPoint presentation. There we go. It has a lot of moving parts. Thank you, Ara. Thank you, Nicola, and Casa Italiana for having me again. I'm here to talk very briefly about a few close encounters between Futurism and cinema. Now, I am not an architect, apologies. I am also not a futurist. And I was thinking in both Ara and Nicola's talk about what futurists would look like today, especially in the age of branded content. Would they have an Instagram and try to hawk cryptocurrencies? Would they be the ones taking Uber helicopters to JFK, flying across our heads? Would they be the ones trying to go to Mars against all odds? In all likelihood, that's what a futurist today would look like. So I would like to take this time to distance myself from that. And I just got my green card recently, so I feel like I'm in a safe spot to say this, even though I know this is being recorded. All right, so we'll touch up on a few things, but there are actually a lot of close encounters. The joke about futurist cinema is that there is no futurist cinema, but I believe there's an expert on futurist cinema in the audience. Amanda Strauven, are you here? So she'll contradict me if that is indeed not the case. Now, there are a few films, and certainly there are manifestos. Obviously, there are many, many manifestos. So I'd like to go over a few and touch upon a few important figures that loom large in the idea of what maybe a futurist cinema could look like. Certainly, I think you've all seen the examples before. We've seen already one still of Metropolis before. We've seen a still of Manhattan, the great Paul Strand, Charles Sheeler documentary about sort of arriving in New York, a day in the life of New York. And there are a few figures, obviously Marinetti, who's been mentioned before, who loom large in this idea of what, at that time, 1908, 1909, early on, could stand for a quote-unquote new cinema, even though cinema had only been quote-unquote invented in 1895 or around that time. So, some people who I think made a big impact on this idea of what a new cinema looks like, and then we'll come to the fact of what does it actually look like, and what would a futurist cinema look like today, perhaps. So first of all, there's Ricciardo Canudo, who was sort of an adjacent futurist. He really lived most of the important parts of his life in Paris. I think he was called Le Parisien, plus Parisien, because of his Italian roots, who wrote very eloquently about this new art form of cinema as early as 1908, so really kind of predating these futurist manifestos and being in touch with some of the most important people. And the ideas of cinema early on, as they were written down by Marinetti, as they were by Canudo, as they were later by French filmmaker Abel Gance, who was at first, like many filmmakers, a struggling screenwriter writing hits for Gaumont Cinema. This idea that there was something to discover, something waiting to happen. And of course, whenever you write about this looming avant-garde, the joke is that no one ever thinks it's happened, right? So it's only in looking back that we discover maybe a new cinema is something that comes to pass. I move on now to a great aesthetic problem which must be emphasized. Art has always been essentially a stylization of life into stillness. The better an artist has been able to express the greater number of quote-unquote typical conditions, that is, the synthetic and immutable states of souls and forms, the greater the recognition he has attained. The cinematograph, on the contrary, achieves the greatest mobility in the representation of life. The thought that it might open the unsuspected horizon of a new art different from all pre-existing manifestations cannot fail to appeal to an emancipated mind, freed from all traditions and constraints. So there's this idea that cinema will be the first of the quote-unquote new art forms. Photography has already been kicked to the curb, partially at least, and one that might also unite all of the other art forms together, right? That it's an art form that is theater, that is painting, that is sculpture, that is certainly poetry and lyricism combined together. That is music, even if there is not music yet on the film itself, but that's being performed live. And so this, you can see, is very close to what the Futurists touch upon slightly later in one of their more personalized manifestos, the one for cinema in 1916. We must liberate film as an expressive medium in order to make it the ideal instrument of a new art, immensely vaster and nimbler than all the existing arts. We are convinced that only thus can it attain the poly-expressiveness, there's that word again, toward which all the most modern artistic researches are moving. Architecture is also often mentioned by Canudo in that same breath. Futurist cinema is creating precisely today the poly-expressive symphony that is, just a year ago, we announced in our manifesto, Weights, Measure, and Prices of Artistic Genius. The most varied elements will go into futurist film as expressive means, from the slice of life to the streak of color from the conventional line of prose, to words in freedom from chromatic and plastic music to the music of objects. In short, it will be painting, architecture, sculpture, words in freedom, music of colors, lines and forms, a clash of objects and realities thrown together at random. So the futurist cinema is everything and nothing at the same time. In the last part of the definition especially, you can tell, if you're taking this at face value, then you'll say, yes, okay, cinema does often combine, especially in the guise that we know it today, with color, with dialogue, with music, all of those things. But does that mean that the latest Netflix iteration of a rom-com is also futurist cinema? By going off of this definition, maybe it is. But the futurist had something very specific in mind, and of the few futurist films that we do have, although most of them, of course, are lost, like most of silent cinema, conservative estimates for the gigantic output of films that were made in the silent period state that about 80% is lost. Some say up to 90%, but because so many films were made at that time, we still luckily have a gigantic amount. But of course, if your specific movement, in this case being Futurism, only made 4 films, then chances are that not a lot of them are going to survive. So the person who is sort of credited for making the quote-unquote first Italian futurist film is Arnaldo Ginna, who was a painter, who was very big in the idea of synesthesia. This is something that's sort of mentioned before as well. Synthesis and synesthesia, the idea of all the arts working in tandem. This is music and dance as it is portrayed. Arnaldo Ginna was also a big proponent of the idea of chromatic music, something that will later in the 1920s and 30s pop up as these abstract expressionist films where music comes through life mostly through abstract iterations of color, and we'll have some examples of that later as well. Now, it's a little bit harder to find out what his film actually looked like. The film is called Vita Futurista. It's from 1916, and in fact, all of the futurist films were made between 1916 and 1917, and there's really only one that survives in a serviceable state. Vita Futurista does not survive. We have some very, very bad, presumably copies of stills that are the only things that survive, by which we can sort of make out that what we are seeing is something that prefigures or makes use of certain aesthetic elements that we'll see later, namely transforming the image cinematographically, using mirrors to shoot in, as the French would be very fond of doing in the 1920s, superimposing images onto one another using multiple exposures to create ghost-like imagery. And of course, we've already heard a lot about this idea of movement, so we can surmise that perhaps the editing pace was quite rapid. Although it seems from the other films and from things we read that these are actually quite conventional and that most of them have sort of a melodramatic base to them. So trying to escape from what is at that time the popular mode of filmmaking. Some of these films have been shown here at Casa Italiana, the dive film, the high-powered, high-octane operatic melodramas with beautiful female stars like Pina Menichelli, with very melodramatic plots. These seem to be somewhat present in these films as well, and they seem to be quite theatrical. Again, mostly from descriptions that we have. So even though these films are announced, not a lot is known about them. Another figure that looms large is Anton Giulio Bragaglia, who was, if we do have a futurist photographer, although there is some debate about that, it is probably Bragaglia, whose work is at the Met and at MoMA, and who created, or perhaps not created, but at the very least engaged with a style that he called fotodinamismo. So basically trying to capture movement in photography through longer exposure, something that certainly at the time, 1910-11, was a little bit more ahead of its day than what other people were doing in that time. And the idea of, in this case, in the bow, capturing movement and making that the antithesis of the stillness that we see in photographs normally became sort of his signature. The other thing that Bragaglia is known for is for creating a space for artists to meet in Rome, the Casa d'Arte Bragaglia with his brothers, which from the late 1910s to the mid-1920s became a place for artists to come together, talk about the various things as artists talk about, money problems, trying to make a living, more money problems. And actually, interestingly also, there was a big crossover with American filmmaking when people started to discover Italy as a picturesque filming location. The Casa d'Arte was known for hosting the entire cast and crew of Ben-Hur in the 1920s, the Cecil B. DeMille film, for quite a long time. And so there were all these crossovers. The Casa d'Arte was known in every big city. In fact, they advertised in the Brooklyn Museum newspaper, to give you an idea. So apart from that, Bragaglia also made a few films, the most well-known of which is Thais, which is a film that engages with architecture in a very interesting way. Is it strictly futurist? Probably not. But I think, at the very least, by virtue of Bragaglia himself, the circle that he was in, the company he kept, and the designs by Enrico Prampolini, we do have the strongest connection that we can get to what would be considered futurist filmmaking. And if we approach this thematically, not to give away any spoilers, it's interesting to note that Thais, as some of the other films that we will mention later, figures around a house that has the capacity to murder, to kill, to suicide, because it hosts an infamous suicide room. And so everything in the house, designed as it may be to be kinematic, moving, is sort of designed as a contraption that might kill the people inside of it, which does indeed happen. And we see that in a number of other films that engage with architecture in that way and that might have futurist leanings, even though the film itself is more of a conventional melodrama in storytelling and editing. It's mostly in its production design and in the house itself that it obviously creates, because it doesn't exist in real life, that it has some interesting things to say. The other two films that Bragaglia makes that come out in the same year, so again, we're looking at an age in which people make a feature film every month, every week sometimes, so there's a gigantic amount of films being made and put out. Il Perfido Incanto is another one of those films. Here we have even less to go off of. Thais has about 40 minutes surviving. What we do have is some, again, remaining designs by Prampolini, who would be the chief person working as production designer for Bragaglia. And so we can see that these spaces are somewhat out of the ordinary, but that's sort of all that we get. The same for Il mio cadavere, which we have, I believe, 2 stills surviving to this day. And all I can say is that this is an unusual staircase for a bedroom, right? And judging from the title and what we see here, the plot is indeed mostly a melodramatic plot. So these futurist filmmakers, this is kind of it. This is the small circle. These are the people who are closest to the ideas. At the very least, they're real Italians, right? That must mean something in this room. And they're engaging with the forum very close to it. During World War I, which even though films were still being made in a lot of countries, they weren't being made in the biggest filmmaking country, which was France. So they were making alongside a few other countries films somewhat in a vacuum that would later have to compete against the flood of American films coming into the market. So even if they existed at that time, they wouldn't have probably been seen by a lot of people, which is, I think, important to note, because what comes afterwards, after the war, is when it starts to get interesting, and when maybe Futurism itself becomes a victim of its own success, of some of the writings by Marinetti, by Canudo. Because in the 1920s is when we see the cinematic avant-garde really sort of take hold. It's hard to pinpoint what all of these films are specifically working for, and if you've met any artists purporting to belong to one specific style, maybe you know that the week after they are now belonging to a different style. And either way, all of these people were working in the same circle. So if maybe they were engaging with Cubism at a certain time, they were engaging with Impressionism at another, with the Style, with Futurism. But the ideas of it and the ideas of movement, of using cinema, especially as a Gesamtkunstwerk, to borrow a Wagnerian term that is also connected to fascism in many ways in the German example, certainly comes up. There are many examples. A lot of them are French. And a lot of these filmmakers are former painters, sculptors, architects. So we already have that intermediality, interdisciplinarity, because we are dealing with people who are coming to cinema as a new medium, one that holds a lot of promise. And what we see in their films, whether we're dealing with Ballet Mécanique, Ménilmontant, Man Ray's work, or Viking Egeling's very abstract work, which sort of takes on this idea of films that are very musical, lyrical, and you would kind of have to imagine the soundtrack being played live to it, right? Color would also be a feature of those, especially when they were brought out first. These are the films that most honestly, most straightforwardly translate the ideas of someone like Canudo, Marinetti, films filled with speed, unique perspectives, often focusing on transport, and putting their cameras on there, frenetic editing techniques. There is so much of it in the 1920s because the whole cinema industry has really imploded after World War I, and there's much less of an impetus, an idea that people have to make film as a collective mass medium, simply because there is cheap American product that cinemas can take. There's no incentive for French filmmakers to make films like they once were because the infrastructure was gone, and that was the case in many countries. So what people did was experiment, show films in small scenic clubs, small halls, to talk to fellow artists about what it really means to make films. Talk to rich friends, usually barons of some sort. Hey, can you give me $1 million to make a film? And oddly enough, they did. They did quite a few times. So these were films that weren't being shown in a lot of places, but were very important and engaged with a lot of the avant-garde techniques that were going on more broadly in art, and certainly helped propagate this idea of a new art much more strongly than the few examples we see in Futurism. Not to be forgotten here, I think, because of that influx of American product in Europe, like people were really bombarded with a lot of American films that had been made in the 1910s, and going into the 1920s, budgets had been growing, stunts had become a big part. And one of the things that we see, especially in one of the darlings of not just futurist artists, but also avant-garde artists in general, is slapstick as a genre. The human body that does things that are, for lack of a better word, cinematic, that engage with space in a way that's not normal. In fact, that's quite fantastical. And a lot of times that was specifically engaging with architecture. This is one of many examples of Buster Keaton's. Harold Lloyd is another person. Laurel and Hardy were known for their antics with skyscrapers. And it's really, in that realm, much more Los Angeles than it is New York. That becomes sort of the locus of engaging with architecture in a cinematic realm. Now, there's other examples, of course, but it never ceases to be spectacular. This is, like I said, just one of many examples of Keaton sort of engaging with architecture right before he jumps on that truck and that starts moving. So these are things, I think, that kind of take those ideas innately, work them in a very commercial cinematic context. And if you were a futurist filmmaker, maybe trying to get back to filmmaking after the war, and you see this, you might as well give up. I think that's the. What else do we see in the 1920s and perhaps the 1930s? I've labeled it the shape of things to come because obviously these ideas of fascism are inherent in society, and there are certain figures and figureheads that are starting to loom ever more large, especially when we think of Germany as well, not just Italy. So the engagement with architecture, and specifically maybe the idea of futurism, comes in the guise of science fiction, utopias, dystopias, and perhaps also the aforementioned city symphonies, which would be the genre of film that celebrates the city as a whole. Manhattan would be one. A day in the life of a city celebrating the city as a locus to live comfortably. But usually that's not the case. Usually buildings, modern buildings especially, the same with modern art. I wrote about this for screening statues. Modern art is out to kill you, right? Don't trust it. It's usually very sharp and pointy. It's very heavy. And it's designed in a way to be impractical. So we see a lot of this in film as well. And specifically in collaborations that bring artists together. So Marcel L'Herbier's film L'Inhumaine, The Inhuman Woman, is an example of this. One that celebrates certainly not just futurist aesthetics. There's a lot of Art Deco in there. There's the style influenced by much of its production crew, Fernand Léger for one, Robert Maillet-Stevens, Alberto Cavalcanti, Claude Honorat, Pierre Charot, and Paul Poiret. So there's quite a few people working on this, and they were specifically inspired by Ricciotto Canudo as well. This house is not only out to kill, it's also out to revive. It has a complete underground chamber of elements that come to life in a sort of a synesthesia, a kinetic movement. Highly recommend you watch this film. It's available online. And as sort of a parting thought, a film that most people have maybe seen in some version, is the film Metropolis, which does sort of borrow from this idea of New York and futurism, and is maybe the film that Marinetti would have liked to have made at a certain point. Which again brings together these designs, but also, as we see there in the Moloch sequence, winks at the 1914 film Cabiria, which is of course not about the future, it's about the past. But this idea that the modern buildings and the modern infrastructure are, at the end of things, unattainable, right? It's being fed by workers, they're not being paid, they're keeping the city alive, and we can't have that. Similarly, in a film like Things to Come, in which New York is looked at sort of melancholy way, you know, oh, they used to live above ground, they were dumber then, they didn't know that we could sustain ourselves underground. And then finally, if you want to see some elements of futurism, fascism coming together today, go to Rockefeller Plaza. This is a little excerpt from a film that I did a couple of years ago that engages with that idea. Not only do we have the figurehead building, 30 Rockefeller Plaza itself, but the designs around it made in the early 1930s, like Lee Laurie's Atlas, some of them were specifically modeled after, in this case, Benito Mussolini. So there's still a lot to see today. All right, I'll leave it there, and everything else we can talk about later. Thank you.
Thank you, Vito. So we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Ali Rahim, who is Professor of Architecture and Director of the Advanced Architecture Design Program at the University of Pennsylvania Weizmann School of Design. He's co-director of CAP, an architectural firm based here in New York and in Shanghai, whose projects span the globe from MoMA to commissions in Shanghai, Tokyo, and Seoul. Alongside a wide range of edited volumes, Professor Rahim's influential books include Catalytic Formations, Contemporary Techniques in Architecture, and Future Offices, looking at the intersection of architecture and digital design. These works explore innovative design practices, emphasizing the role of technology and digital methods in shaping contemporary architecture. So please join me in welcoming Ali Rahim.
Wow. Thank you very much for the invitation, Ara and Nicola. Let me just... Okay, here we go. Thank you very much. As this populates, I spent a year in Rome. That's my claim to the association with Casa Italiana. So thank you very much for having me. Oops, I don't know what's happening with the coloration, which could be a problem. It's meant to pop up, but maybe I should try replugging it. Sorry. Yeah, okay. All right, I won't touch it. All right, so I'm going to start by showing this image. And for me, the relationship of technique to the technical and technology is really important in the development of culture and cultural transformation. So once we think about or speculate upon what might happen in the future, it's just important to understand the relationship of these three elements. And for example, this is a really important image because in this situation, and obviously flight has something to do with the futurists, but in this situation, the technical, which is the horsepower of the engine, or the technology, which is the aeroplane, is not going to save your life. It's actually technique. It's how you fly and operate the plane and what the maneuvers are that you make in this situation to survive, right? So for us, I practice CAP with my partner, Hina Jamal. We really look at the relationship of technique, how it pressures the technical, how the technical evolves a different technology, and with it comes with a new aesthetics. So currently, we've been working in the realm, or the cultural milieu has been the digital. And more recently, it has been artificial intelligence, which has taken the digital to a completely different realm. So if you think about how culture is operating and feeding forward between technique, the technical and technology, is also able to forecast or develop new ways of thinking about aesthetics. So AI, when we run our simulations, etc., what we feel the aesthetic that comes up is disjunctive continuity. And so I'm going to show you one project that we're working on in Seoul. And the disjunctive continuity is really developed through seams. So architectural seams are where any two materials or elements come together. Seams, specifically in digitally driven architecture, are often treated as defaults. The way most digitally driven work is developed, there's a formal investigation, a big design move, and all the architectural details, tessellation, structural and material connections and seams are derived from that, right? So you have a large vision, and then you go in and articulate that vision. I think that we should recognize about this approach is that it promotes a certain architectural hierarchy in the design process, and it privileges aspects of architecture which are not derived by architects, because this is software designers, right? So if once architects operate within the frame of software, they're using protocols and software designers have designed to actually develop their projects within the discipline of architecture. So what we at CAP do is we invert this logic on its head, in particular by using the scene and detailing as starting points, and then recalibrating them into overall wholes. So one specific area of interest we've been interested in for its complexity and modularity is urban housing, as explored in the Han River Master Plan project, commissioned by Samsung Construction and Technology, with a fresh focus on disjunctive continuity at the detail, at the building form, and then at the master plan. We can move from intricacy of assembly and nuanced spatial design to the creation of whole new architectural typologies in construction workflows or the reconfiguration of existing ones. So the Han River is in central Seoul, South Korea. And the predetermined sort of housing typologies in the 60s and 70s are really kind of what shapes the majority of Seoul, if you've been there. So the challenge here was really to create significant differences between buildings across the master plan while maintaining specified building forms. This is in strict contrast to the monotonous and impersonal 20th century mass housing developments that typically exist in Seoul. So we had several constraints, including zoning codes, unit sizes based in tax codes, and the need to create a unique facade for each building. So in the spirit of aesthetic intervention, we sought to use a highly graphic and variable facade strategy with a deep investment. The approach that we had was really thinking about the detailing and prefabrication that was essential to this project. So we sought to create a design sequence that breaks with the homogeneity of the original housing design while enhancing its attractiveness in terms of cost effectivity and construction efficiency. So the project is developed at several scales, as I mentioned, and seeks to achieve a visually cohesive aesthetic, which is still disjunctive, composed of details that enable different performances and programmatic criteria. This is accomplished in multiple ways, ranging from facade details to the overall master plan. So to start, the facades are composed of 10 unique prefabricated frames, each with its own architectural detailing. Frames sit flush, are recessed, or protrude from the facade. The edges of each frame are either wide, narrow, or bend and become an angle. Some frames contain a seam, making them appear bifurcated. Other frames sit adjacent to or on top of one another, creating a reveal between frames of different widths. Multiple frames are also grouped together in larger frames to create nesting effects. So further, the materiality of each frame changes depending on its width relative to the other parts of the facade. If the frame is extremely wide, a seam is carved into it to give it a narrow reading while visually reinforcing the metal on the facade. When we group multiple wider frames together, we use metal as the facade material, making the building more opaque. At the other extreme, we use very thin frames assembled next to each other to develop the most transparent parts of the facade. As frames oscillate in width, the glass to metal ratio is altered, which is aimed to giving an overall sense of cohesion and aesthetics to the building. Frame components and glazing articulate movement across the facade to enliven and enrich the generic form of the building footprint. All of these different facade arrangements and material transitions are enabled by a single detailing and design system. The frame components work well within the limitation of Samsung's production and manufacturing techniques. When I go there, the conversation's always shaped around how they can actually build things. And So to push the construction industry into doing anything that's just slightly out of the ordinary is very difficult. And you can see in Seoul, once again, that if there's anything that is slightly curved, they have real trouble in making it, particularly cost effectively. So Samsung's knowledge of manufacturing techniques is essential to the development of this project. So the knowledge set the limit amount of variation, how much they could actually build within their budget, and what the variations are set by constraints that allow for these constraints allow for the customization of each building, but within a realm. So by integrating and optimizing the frame design with prefabricated processes and limitations from the outside of the project, we are able to achieve cost-effective, mass-customized results. And they gave us housing topologies that are really based on systems that they use with regards to tax code. So if you have a unit that's 59.99 square meters, you pay much lower tax than if it's 60 square meters, for example, right? So it's very carefully calibrated. So the typology here, because of the need of repetition, actually opens up an opportunity to push forward new design processes with effects for both the housing typology in terms of new configuration and performative capacities, as well as manufacturing and construction in terms of implementation of new technologies. So by asserting mass customization at such a large scale, architecture can put pressure on the construction industry to implement technologies that it might otherwise be slow to adapt. Instead of one detail in a building, there are 10, which even in a public housing context is a readily achievable system, although this is not, this is for profit. Because there are not 1 but 18 buildings, the project is able to achieve an economy of scale. The typology provides a scenario for adapting to automotive models of manufacturing and bring them forward to housing. So customizable options at different scales can be swapped in and out while maintaining a basic design system and processing line. This creates opportunities to vary materials in ways that enable higher levels of performance, whether programmatic, phenomenological, or environmental in nature. By prefabricating components and assemblies in off-site manufacturing facilities, agency and expression are given back to the multiple stakeholders, to the city in terms of aesthetics, builders in terms of how they work, and residents in terms of the feel and quality of their homes. Variations in framing details are echoed in larger scale configurations of units and relations between buildings throughout the project. For instance, with only minor alterations to the core and chase locations, we transformed the unit organizations from a static repetition of residential units into dynamic layouts with enough flexibility that they can change in plan location as needed. The buildings here adhere to strict regulations, including unit size, while maximizing the amount of variation of views and interior space within planned configurations. Configurations were determined primarily because of the locations of the vertical building systems, including circulation, as well as dry and wet shafts. In some cases, there are living rooms in the corner of the buildings, and in others, there are bedrooms. So the locations of these two-bedroom unit changes mediating between efficiency, layout, quality of space with views. These unit types are developed per building, and so the location of the buildings then determine what unit goes next to what, at what level. And the locations of these chases provide us with opportunities to alter kitchen and bathroom layouts. So the interaction between the facades and the variations of units develop nuance for each residential unit in orientation, elevation, and window performance. The facade brings in light in different ways, frames specific views, and makes strategic areas of the unit more opaque or transparent than others. And if you notice, the projects, all of the facades in some way or the other do work with vectors and vectorial capacities, which I think a lot was shown of earlier in some of the Futurist dialogues. The combination of strategies give us 64 unit plans per building. This enables the resident to select from a menu of features large windows, small windows, what the orientation is, etc. And these then affect the location of the units next to them, and hence the building and the building form next to them, generating a master plan. So the elevations appear distinct, disjunct, yet they're tied together by an underlying tectonic and aesthetic logic of the building as a whole. So these constraints develop the most efficient master plan possible, tying discontinuity between building forms together with landscapes of similar elements at different scales. So really, I mean, we've reinvented a way of thinking about housing for Samsung, and that's, I think, really an important move, because not only does it increase affordability, but it also gives each resident an identity, which none of these communities currently have an identity. So the relationship of city and urbanism is super important, because currently the buildings actually have numbers painted on the sides of them. So they can only identify which building they live in by the 4-digit number that's painted on the side of the building. And just to show you kind of the variation that just 10 different details give to the overall arrangement of architecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. And then finally, we have an old friend and colleague, Spyros Papapetros. We were in graduate school together at Berkeley in the last millennium. So it's wonderful to have him here. He's associate professor in the history and theory of architecture at Princeton University. His work focuses on the historiography of art and architecture, the intersections between architecture and the visual arts, as well as the relationship between architecture, psychoanalysis, and the history of psychological aesthetics. The recipient of fellowships from both the Getty Research Institute and the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal. He's also the author of On the Animation of the Inorganic, Art, Architecture, and the Extension of Life, published in 2012 with Chicago, and co-editor of Retracing the Expanded Field, Encounters Between Art and Architecture with MIT Press. He's also the co-curator of the exhibition Pre-Architectures, currently on display at the Siva Art Center in Brussels, and the co-editor of the first edition of Friedrich Kiesler's book project Magic Architectures, to be published by MIT Press in June of 2025. So please join me in welcoming Professor Spyros Papapetros. All right. Hi, Spyros. I'm just trying to pull up the... I'm terrible at how this... there we go. All right. Go for it.
Okay. All right, I'm coming late to the party, and I'm afraid I have to offer very little. What I'm offering tonight is only kind of a nerdy detail on the historiographic reception of Futurism after World War II, actually. I am not a Futurist scholar. I'm a historian of architecture, and I'm precisely interested in the moment that Futurism enters history. That might sound even paradoxical, the same way that all avant-gardes have a difficult relationship to history or becoming part of it, because once you become history, once you become part of history, you become sort of history and part of a museum. But I'm precisely interested in that kind of tension. And I'm also talking about a history that was written by an architect, a practicing architect, Friedrich Kiesler, who is not known as a futurist, but he's more known as a surrealist. And yet, at some point, he met Sant'Elia. So, my small offering for this Futurist party is a single old and yellowed sheet of paper whose lower section reads, "Sent, wrong, obviously, right? Elia, dash, skyscraper, city, multi, crossed out, sky, streets. Obviously, he means corridors. These few words are then geometrically enclosed inside a rectangle, like a label or an electrical marquee that pronounces even more loudly the misspelled name of the futurist architect, elevated by his sky-high architectural visions. Sant'Elia's name appears below a paragraph where the names of other well-known 20th century architects appear, namely, here, Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier, as well as Buckminster Fuller, via his Dymaxion house, and another design described as a horizontal skyscraper, whose architectural author is also the author of this manuscript draft. Indeed, the page with Sant'Elia's name on its is part of a two-page draft proposal by the US-Austrian exile émigré architect Frederick Kissler for his book project titled Magic Architecture, and subtitled The Story of Human Housing, written after World War II and submitted to publishers circa 1946, but ultimately never published. Among other things, Magic Architecture presents a genealogy of unrealized architectures, or an architecture that was never built, by artists like El Greco and Piranesi, or the so-called utopians, from Filarete's skyscrapers of the Middle Ages, as Kissler calls them, to Bruno Taut's dissolution of the modern city, a form of genealogy in which Sant'Elia and so-called skyscraper and skyscrapers could be added as an appropriate appendix. Note that the Sant'Elia label is hand-drawn in pencil, while the rest of the manuscript text, to which the label lies underneath, is written in ink, as are the loud line strikes on the left of the paper that amplify the éclat or the resonance of this historiographic manuscript, as in a Futurist manifesto. This means that Sant'Elia appears or reappears as an afterthought in this art historical genealogy of what Kissler describes as a 20th century development of architecture, that is the object of the architect's narrative on a history of housing that starts with prehistory and the caves and ends with the housing shelters of Buckminster Fuller, and of course Kissler's own horizontal skyscraper mentioned in this manuscript among Corbusier, Fuller, and above Sant'Elia. Kissler's draft proposal is not without social and political considerations. Quote, mass production fosters mass education, and the planners and the architects scheme now not the emperors, not for land or industrial magnates, but they are for every man. They promise the paradise not in heaven and not somewhere in the country, but in every home. And there, Kissler asks, are these projects utopia like those of the past? End quote. It's after this question that Sant'Elia and his skyscrapers appear as an epiphany, not as an answer or a resolution, but another question and a provocation. In fact, Kissler put together in one of the composite illustration plates that illustrates his project on magic architecture, the projects of these three architects mentioned in this early draft, namely his own so-called horizontal skyscraper, which is a long series of terrace houses based on an earlier scheme for an almost endlessly expanding horizontal structure, whose authorship has actually been disputed. Le Corbusier's visionary diorama for the city of the present or tomorrow, for his book on urbanism. And third, Frank Lloyd Wright's unrealized St. Mark's in the Bowery Tower, which might, I think, or might have prompted that reverie on Saint Elia. All three of which Kissler describes at the bottom of his plate as, quote, utopias of the machine age, perhaps as a response to the question he had posed in his text presenting these projects as utopias, but with a question mark, often after which comes Saint or Sant Elia, perhaps in a surrealist association with Frank Lloyd Wright's Tower of St. Mark. Note that Sant'Elia appears only once among Kissler's drafts, as an afterthought to a book proposal that was in fact never sent to a publisher, and his unpublished manuscript has no other references to Sant'Elia or the Futurist in its narrative of the quasi-utopian presidents of magic architecture in the 20th century. But there is another longer list of names of architects and projects, including a number of visionary towers, which may present another genealogy in which Sant'Elia and its own housing tower schemes for La Città Nuova of 1914 could be inscribed. I refer to this typewritten list, which starts with Filarete, as you can see, city of Sforzira, and mentions Leonardo's designs, Leonardo da Vinci, but then ends up with Bruno Taut and the triad of machine-age skyscraper projects by Kistler, Le Corbusier, and Frank Lloyd Wright, here tentatively amplified by a reference to Garnier, and apparently his designs for La Cité Industrielle, but also unrealized projects that do not subscribe to the machine, such as Scheerbutt, and typed at the very bottom, Tatlin's Tower project model for the Third International. That shows exactly the sort of political sort of origin of that genealogy. That discloses, even at the very end of this list of unrealized architectural proposals, its equally unfulfilled social and political potential. Among these other references is a pencil scribble reference to Bruegel's painting of the Tower of Babel, a reproduction of which does show up among Kistler's plate. The philosopher Jacques Derrida has famously argued in an interview in the architectural periodical Domus that, quote, if the Tower of Babel had been completed, there would be no architecture. Only the incompletion of the tower makes it possible for architecture, as well as the multitude of language, to have a history, end quote. As Derrida reminds his interlocutors in Domus, the Tower of Babel was originally constructed in order to dominate and colonize the world by means of a common language. The deconstruction of the tower represents the foiling of the same plan for political and linguistic domination. The correlation then between incompletion and the possibility of a history, and even the very existence and continuity of the perennially or endlessly, in Kistler's term, architectural project, may disclose a different interpretation for the abiding legacy of all of these incomplete towers, including Sant'Elia's as well as Kistler's own. As Kistler would describe on top of his list of unrealized towers, here, modern man, if you can read it, is obsolete, which means he's neither obsolete, which is probably what he tries to say, nor absolute, but absolutely obsolete and obsoletely absolute. The architect's associational neologism of obsolescence crowns with a matching epigram the towering list of the so-called architectural utopias, while the architect, in fact, repeatedly insists that his own magic architecture is not a utopia, as it might be misunderstood. The same misunderstanding, I would argue, might apply to the architectural projects of Sant'Elia. As previously mentioned, magic architecture was never published. Just like the series of towers and other visionary projects it included, its own coming out on this world remained unrealized. But if indeed magic architecture is a missing chapter in 20th century literature on architecture, then the book that this chapter belonged had already been written by others. I refer to a list of publications like Ulrich Konrad's exhibition and later anthology of Fantastische Architektur, published in 1963 as Fantastic Architecture in English, or The Architecture of the Imagination, in which the entire lineage from Taut to Sant'Elia, but also Kistler, would be illustrated. The English edition of the book was mostly very negatively, actually, reviewed by Rainer Banham in the Art Bulletin, whose own alternative lineage in his theory and design of the first machine age aimed to align the Futurist and Sant'Elia with the technological precedents of modern architecture and not the utopias of the Expressionists. but a precedent to this rediscovery of alternative strands of genealogies of modernism in the 1960s, including the rehabilitation of Futurism, was the well-known exhibition on visionary architecture curated by Arthur Dexler at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1960, where next to the designs again of Louis Kahn, Le Corbusier, Buckminster Fuller, and Kistler, represented here by two rooms in which a large model of his endless house was exhibited, as the exhibition press release announced, quote, more than 30 ideas for cities on and over water and under the ground, for buildings that incorporate roads and roads that incorporate buildings were included. Obviously, a historical reference, that is, to urban visions of the Futurists, whose designs were also represented by Sant'Elia. And indeed, before the rooms with the modern architect's visions, there was a room with a so-called historical introduction that included works by Leonardo da Vinci, Piranesi, and other architects of the past, some of whose visions had proved prophetic, as the announcement says, always according to the MoMA press release. A photograph of that room with a historical introduction shows Sant'Elia's designs for La Città Nuova center stage, right next, as you can see, in the photograph and a reproduction to Filarette's city of Sforcida and another, quote, visionary precedents, as another visionary precedent beginning in the Renaissance, and also represented on the other part of the world where unfortunately you can't see much. Oh, you can see it here. Leonardo da Vinci's ideal city reproduced on the wall before and across Filarete and Sant'Elia, as well as the Enlightenment of Etienne Louis Boulet on the other side of the wall, and his cenotaph for Isaac Newton. The architecture of both Boulet and Ledoux at that time being rediscovered in that period as the 18th century precedents of 20th century, quote-unquote, utopias. Thus, I would argue, and here I will close, in visionary architecture, once again Sant'Elia communicated with Kistler, albeit from a distance and in different rooms. But at the same time, they communicated directly via the reinvented genealogy of unbuilt architectural projects that recluttered transhistorically both of their own projects and artifacts. The outline of such architectural projection is once again on the historiographic graph. These lines that frame the architect's name in a perspective, if you notice, that reveals that it's projects that project or penetrate the skyline that is on a different plane from the historical page that has been inserted. Thank you.
I like what Ali said about the tools in which he uses and how they influence what he's making. Were there new tools that the Futurists were using that influenced how they were thinking about things, what they were making? That's basically the question.
No, I know Ali will probably have an answer, a much more sophisticated answer, but that, I mean, in terms of just new materials, right? I mean, Sant'Elia was one of the first to talk about the use of concrete, actually. So the way that materials drives practice is absolutely, I mean, it's a terrific question, but Ali can say more about precisely how that happens. And now dematerialized, right? I mean, because AI is one of the materials in a sense.
That's right. I think, well, thank you very much. I think that it happens that initially it happens using the tools that one has available, but then one begins to explore every aspect of the discipline, right? So it goes from manufacturing to materials and they all go hand in hand. But it does, for example, currently there's so much innovation using AI in robotics, for example, and making systems just much more efficient. So all industries are becoming more efficient. That's led by the automobile industry, just because they spend $500 billion a year, I think, on research, and the construction industry spends $100 million, right, on research. So you can see how much is exploding within the automobile industry and how many new technologies are coming up in artificial intelligence is operating all the capacities of an automobile. And I think that is fascinating. And for us, it is how do you best incorporate that into the discipline, but not being too far ahead in time, because one wants to actually build this material that's available to us today. I mean, I don't know. In a long version, I think I've answered your question.
One interesting remark on this aspect and the automotive innovation in the context here is that Fiat Lingotto, the car factory in Turin, was at the same time claimed by the Futurists and by the Rationalists. It was included in the first exhibition of the Rationalists. The architect himself, at the time that he built Lingotto, was an elderly person, and he was an engineer, actually, he was not an architect. And the factory was built exclusively out of functional concerns and not really with a thinking about the aesthetics or belonging to a school of architecture. And the result, though, was so remarkable that they included him in the exhibition as one of the only two buildings that actually had been built in a rationalist style. And then in 1934, mind you, the factory was inaugurated in 23, so 11 years later, once Marinetti is invited and he goes to the racetrack that is on the rooftop and thinks, well, this is obviously futurist. And so it's interesting how automobiles come back in defining the architecture of modernity.
And in Le Corbusier's Towards a New Architecture itself, the Model T, right, is an example of architecture in Nuce. The car itself is considered, by Europeans, like along with the ocean liner and other kind of industrial grain elevators, etc., far more interesting architecturally and in terms of materials than 19th century buildings. So the car, I mean, that's incredibly interesting to hear the extent to which the automobile industry is in some ways the avant-garde of research into materials that in turn drives elements of architecture. It's incredibly interesting.
It used to be the military, right? It used to be the military. And the IMSS, etc., there's a huge history. But even relative to the military, it's 25 times more than what the military spends on research currently.
There's one shift of perception also that I found interesting, seeing some of your examples, and especially as we visualize architecture in relation to the futurist aeropintura, the idea of looking at things from the sky, the First World War being, the first to be really waged from the skies, and that idea of now living in the sky and seeing the city from the sky and visualizing it that way, I thought is interesting as well. You see it in a lot of Fritz Lang's work where obviously these are maquettes and models in cities that don't exist, but a lot of the perspectives are humanly impossible, which provides interesting views from building a city from the sky.
So how will New York City's skyline evolve?
Only bungalows from now on. It's recorded, right?
I think New York City is really based on real estate value, right? So the potential to do anything incredible today is limited by every developer saying you have to take up every square inch of our zoning envelope or you're losing us money. So the innovation really is limited to 6 inches, which is the envelope. And unfortunately, that has some massive ramifications with regards to zoning as well.
Yeah, I think it didn't escape Kistler or anyone in the interwar period how precisely the ideas and the iconographies of the skyscraper, which started with this large social content, right, were commercialized in commercial skyscrapers in New York in particular. Kistler lived on 7th and 14th Street, and from his penthouse apartment he could see Rockefeller Center, he could see everything, and he could see the historicist crowns, which to him were a business logic. So it was very poignant to him to see precisely the so-called utopian or rather political content of what the tower meant, from the Tower of Babel to Sherbert to Bruno Taut, all of this generation actually being entirely business fight in New York at around that period. And Magic Architecture is written in reaction to all that, and even the invocation of Sant'Elia is precisely on that, to reinstate a social vision that comes with that.
Maybe one last question?
Hi. You showed the pictures of the glass steel buildings, and you talked about how you were getting economies of scale. You used the buzzwords of today, the futuristic modern words of affordable housing. How are you able to attain that when you're doing smaller buildings and you're not doing cookie cutter buildings? You're doing different designs for building. How are you able to get the cost down?
I guess it's speculative, but the way I would think about it is if you're doing one house, it's completely different than doing a community of houses and homes, right? Because as soon as you do a community of homes, you can scale up the economies, right? Because you're doing, say, different types of windows, but the way they're produced and manufactured can be done with economies of scale, and then when you go and design each individuated house, it would then have its own particularities, and it wouldn't look like its neighbor. So you'd have to think about it in that way.
All right. Thank you all for coming out on a rainy evening. And thanks to all of our